Nick Lawrence was about to ruin his life. It wasn't his first time thinking it, but this time, it was different. He was alone in his apartment at 2:30 a.m., surrounded by chaos. Books on physics stacked haphazardly on the floor, whiteboards covered with formulas no one but him could understand, and empty coffee mugs scattered like discarded thoughts. A stray laser pointer blinked from the corner, its red dot reflecting off a metal sheet covered with magnets. Nick was a graduate student, too deeply immersed in his research to care about the world beyond his cramped living space. He was supposed to be studying gravity, the force that held the universe together. But instead of carefully reading textbooks, he was reprogramming a drone to carry sensors, trying to simulate the gravitational anomalies he had been theorizing about for months. The late-night tinkering had begun as a harmless distraction from the soul-crushing weight of his thesis, until tonight, when something entirely unexplainable happened. The coffee pot on the counter started to hum. It wasn't a loud hum, but enough for him to notice. His eyes were heavy, mind floating in the haze of caffeine deprivation, but he couldn't ignore it. He stumbled over to the counter and watched as the coffee pot seemed to float a fraction of an inch off the surface. He blinked, rubbed his eyes, and then it dropped. A perfect, straight fall, as though it had simply been waiting for gravity to act upon it. Nick scratched his head, a nervous chuckle escaping his lips. He was delirious. That was the only explanation. No, he muttered, shaking his head. I haven't slept in 48 hours. I'm just seeing things. He walked over to his small workbench, a cluttered mess of computers and wire-rigged prototypes. Trying to ground himself, he focused on a piece of paper with a mathematical equation scribbled hastily in his handwriting. His brain was working on autopilot as he tried to piece together what had just happened. Then, for no reason at all, a pen on his desk rolled toward the edge and stopped, hovering above the surface as though caught by invisible strings. His mouth went dry. This wasn't possible. It couldn't be possible. His heart raced as he reached for the pen. The moment his fingers brushed against it, the pen dropped and rolled onto the floor with a soft clink. Okay. This wasn't normal. Nick wasn't a religious man, but he could swear there was something supernatural at play here. He had no idea how, no idea why, but his body was suddenly attuned to forces that defied everything he had ever learned in his physics classes. The force of gravity, he was controlling it. All right, focus, he said aloud, trying to calm himself. He took a deep breath and steadied his shaking hands. There's got to be an explanation. Maybe it's something I missed in my research. Maybe it's a trick of the brain, a misfire in my neurons. Still, something deep inside him told him he wasn't imagining this. Something was changing in him, something he couldn't control or even begin to comprehend. He looked around at his apartment, his world. The clutter, the chaos, and then, the unthinkable happened. He stepped forward, his foot barely grazing the ground, and suddenly, without warning, his body floated an inch off the floor. Holy! Nick yelped. He flailed his arms, trying to steady himself. The world spun briefly, and he panicked, reaching out to grab hold of the nearest object. He yanked a book from the shelf, but the simple act of grabbing it sent him spinning out of control. Books, papers, and gadgets flew up into the air as he levitated. He let out a scream, half exhilarated, half terrified, as he found himself floating around his apartment like some kind of lost astronaut. His feet brushed against the ceiling, and his heart hammered in his chest. Okay. This is bad. Really bad. He took another deep breath, trying to steady his nerves. He had to think. This was not something you figure out on a Tuesday night after too much caffeine. He focused. He didn't know how, but he focused. With effort, he willed himself back down, slowly lowering his feet until he was standing again, albeit shaking like a leaf. Nick stared at the empty space around him. The floor was covered in papers, pens, books, and magnets. All had been displaced when he lost control. For the first time in his life, Nick Lawrence was truly at a loss for words, but as his heart slowed, his mind started to race again. There were questions, too many questions. He had to figure out what was happening. The next few hours passed in a blur. Nick spent the rest of the night conducting test after test on himself, figuring out how to control this strange new ability. He experimented with levitating smaller objects at first, pencils, staplers, and his phone. With every test, he gained more control. He discovered that he could make things float in mid-air, suspend them with just a thought, but if he lost focus for even a second, the object would fall with a resounding crash. The more he thought about gravity, the more he realized that he wasn't just manipulating objects. He was manipulating the very fabric of the universe, or, at least, his immediate reality. As dawn approached, Nick felt his mind racing. He sat down in his chair, staring at the ceiling. His thoughts were a tangled mess. This ability, it wasn't something he'd ever encountered in his research. Sure, there were theories, there were ideas, but no one had ever done this. Humans weren't supposed to control gravity. It was a force of nature, relentless and unyielding, but what if it was? What if gravity wasn't some immovable force but rather an ability waiting to be unlocked in certain individuals? What if this was the next step in human evolution? That thought hit Nick like a freight train. He woke up in the late afternoon, his mind still buzzing with the implications of what he had just discovered. His first instinct was to hide. To tell no one. There was no way he could risk this getting out. The government would be all over him, scientists would be trying to replicate his experiments, and the media would be all over it. But then, there was the part of him that couldn't ignore the possibility of something much bigger. Maybe he wasn't the only one. Maybe there were others out there. Maybe there were people who had awakened, like he had. Maybe they were out there, struggling with the same questions, the same confusion, and maybe he could find them. He grabbed his laptop and began searching for any signs of similar phenomena. There were plenty of stories online, strange incidents of objects floating, strange bursts of power, unexplained events. But none of them were real. None of them were scientific. He could feel the need to find others, to understand more, building inside him. If this was evolution, it wasn't just his secret to keep. It was time to wake up the world. The next few days were a blur. Nick sent messages to obscure forums, dropping cryptic notes, hoping someone would reach out. He posted his own findings, carefully leaving out the part where he had levitated. He didn't want to seem like a crazy person. He wasn't a nutcase. He was a scientist. A scientist who was on the edge of discovering something incredible. Something world-changing, and slowly, it began to work. People responded. Some were skeptical. Some were curious. But one message stood out among the rest. It was from a young woman named Lily. She had been in a car accident a few months ago. During the crash, she said, something had changed. For a brief moment, she had been able to control the force of the car, stopping it from crashing into a tree. She had never told anyone about it, until now. Nick's heart raced. He wasn't alone. Nick sat there for a moment, staring at the message from Lily. It wasn't just the words that sent a shiver down his spine, but the implications. She knew. She had experienced something similar to what he had, something he had thought was beyond human comprehension, beyond anything he could explain. He needed to know more. He had to. He quickly typed a response, his fingers flying over the keyboard. You're not alone, he wrote. I've experienced something similar. It's not a hallucination. It's real. I can show you, but we need to meet. This is bigger than we think. He hit send before he could second-guess himself. For a moment, he just stared at the blinking cursor on the screen, his pulse quickening. He didn't know who Lily was, or what she might have been through, but he had a feeling that the two of them could figure this out. They had to. An hour later, Lily replied. She was cautious, but intrigued. She agreed to meet at a public cafe, someplace neutral. Nick didn't hesitate. He knew he had to get out of his apartment, away from the chaos of his mind and the overwhelming pressure of the unknown. The cafe was small and cozy, tucked away on a quiet street. The smell of fresh coffee and baked goods filled the air, and the hum of conversation surrounded him. Nick arrived early, nervously checking his phone every few minutes, glancing at the door. He hadn't felt like this in a long time, unsure, almost giddy with anticipation, but also fearful. What if Lily was just someone who had heard about levitation and was chasing a fantasy? What if she didn't believe him? What if he was just a freak? Then, the door opened, and in walked Lily. She was in her mid-20s, with messy brown hair pulled back into a loose ponytail, wearing a casual hoodie and jeans. She looked like someone who could easily blend into a crowd, someone who didn't want to be noticed. But her eyes, there was something about them, something a little distant, a little haunted. Nick stood up before he even realized it, his heart thudding in his chest. "You must be Nick," she said with a hesitant smile, her voice soft but steady. "Yeah," Nick replied, shaking her hand. "It's good to meet you. You really experienced it?" He couldn't help the rush of words that came out all at once. Lily nodded, her expression guarded. "Yeah. The car crash. I don't know what happened, but for a second, I felt like I could stop it. Like I could make everything go in slow motion. I know it sounds crazy, but I just had this feeling. It was like the world around me slowed down, like I could control it." Nick's heart raced. "That's exactly it. I've been doing things that shouldn't be possible. And I think, no, I know, there's more of us. This isn't some freak accident. It's something real. We're not crazy." Lily sat down slowly, her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee. "So, you think this is some kind of evolution? That we're, what, the next step in human development?" "I think it's possible," Nick said, his voice lowering. "The ability to control gravity, it's not something we're taught about, but I think it's something buried deep inside us. Like a genetic mutation waiting to be triggered." He leaned forward. "I've tested it. I've been experimenting. I can make things float, manipulate the direction of falling objects. It's like I'm becoming attuned to gravity in a way I never imagined." Lily looked around, making sure no one was listening. "So, what? You think we're going to change the world? That we're going to just wake everyone up to this?" Nick's smile was a mix of excitement and uncertainty. "That's what I hope. But we're not alone in this. I believe there are others, people who have the same abilities, who haven't even figured it out yet. We need to find them. We need to reach out." The words hung in the air between them. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Finally, Lily set her coffee down with a soft clink. "And what happens when we find them? What do we do then?" Nick leaned back in his chair, running a hand through his hair. "We need to understand what this is. What it means for us. But more than that, we need to know how to control it. This is bigger than us, Lily. If we can master this, we can change everything. But we have to be careful. There's a lot of fear out there." Lily frowned. "Fear? You think people will be afraid of us?" "I don't think." "I know," Nick said, his voice serious. "People are afraid of what they don't understand. And they won't understand us. The moment we show the world what we can do, we're not just going to be treated like freaks. We're going to be seen as a threat. They'll fear us, maybe even try to control us." Lily was quiet for a moment, her mind clearly turning over what Nick had said. "So what do we do? Do we hide?" Nick shook his head. "No. We don't hide. We don't have to. But we need to be smart. We need to be careful who we trust. There's a lot at stake here." After a long pause, Lily spoke again, her voice quieter this time. "And what about you? What do you want? Nick looked her in the eyes. I want to understand what's happening. I want to find others like us. But I also want to make sure we don't let this power fall into the wrong hands. The next few weeks were a blur of late nights, frantic research, and growing tension. Nick and Lily began to work together, reaching out to others in secret online forums, trying to find more individuals who might have experienced something like they had. It wasn't easy. Most people thought they were crazy, or they simply dismissed the idea. But slowly, little by little, they found more and more people. There was Jordan, a yoga instructor from Oregon who had accidentally discovered his ability to control gravity during a meditation retreat. There was Maria, a college student from New York, who had been caught in an elevator when the power went out and had somehow suspended herself in midair for several minutes, just enough time to save herself from injury. Each person Nick and Lily found had their own story, their own experience with gravity manipulation. Some had it under control, others were still terrified of it, unsure of how to wield it. But they all shared one thing, the same ability, and it was clear to Nick that this was no coincidence. Gravity control wasn't just something that happened. It was something that was happening, part of a larger pattern, a new evolution of humanity that was beginning to unfold. But as much as he wanted to believe that, he couldn't ignore the growing sense of danger, because someone was watching them. Nick first noticed it when he started getting messages from an anonymous source, messages that were oddly specific, almost as if they knew everything he was doing. The messages were cryptic, always signed with the same strange name, Dr. Helen Foster. I know what you're doing, Nick, one of the messages said. I know what you found. You don't know the consequences of your actions. If you continue on this path, it will be your undoing. Trust me, I can help you. But you must stop. Before it's too late. Nick didn't know who this Dr. Foster was, but the warning felt too real to ignore. He shared the message with Lily, who immediately became suspicious. This feels like more than just a random threat, she said. They know too much about us. And she was right. The more Nick dug into Dr. Foster's background, the more he realized that the woman wasn't just a stranger. She was a scientist, one who had worked with the government on classified research about human evolution. And she had been investigating anomalies like the one Nick had discovered, anomalies that involved manipulating gravity. But why had she warned him? And more importantly, why had she been so cryptic? Nick didn't know the answers, but the more he thought about it, the more he realized that Dr. Foster wasn't just some scientist trying to stop him. She was part of something much bigger, something that was already beginning to fight back. The fight had only just begun. Nick couldn't shake the feeling that something bigger was at play, and as the days wore on, the tension continued to build. The warnings from Dr. Foster, cryptic, mysterious, and increasingly frequent, weighed heavily on his mind. It was as if she were always watching, always one step ahead. But what did she want? Why was she reaching out to him, specifically? He couldn't afford to ignore her, but at the same time, he couldn't let fear dictate his next steps. The more Nick thought about it, the more convinced he became that she wasn't just trying to stop him. She was trying to control him, to control them, the gravity controllers. And that meant one thing: if they didn't act quickly, they'd lose control of their own fate. Lily was on the same page. After seeing the growing number of people who had similar abilities, they both knew that the time for caution was over. If they wanted to understand this power, they had to take the next step, to show the world what was happening, to make people see that this wasn't something to fear but something to embrace. The only question now was how to do it without getting caught in the crossfire. The group of gravity controllers was growing steadily, but it wasn't just their numbers that concerned them. It was the attention they were drawing. They couldn't risk being discovered by the wrong people, people who would try to shut them down, people who would weaponize their abilities, people like Dr. Foster. There was too much at stake, too much unknown. Nick, we can't keep hiding forever, Lily said one evening as they sat in his apartment, discussing their next steps. We're doing this in the shadows, and it's not enough. You said we could change everything. We can't change anything if we stay afraid. Nick nodded, but he felt the weight of the decision. He had always been the cautious one, the one who calculated every move, who thought things through. But there was no room for thinking anymore. This was no longer just about discovering their abilities, it was about deciding what kind of world they wanted to live in. A world where they were hunted, silenced, or controlled, or a world where they could stand free, where their powers were not a threat but an opportunity. "I know," he said quietly. "I know. But if we show ourselves, if we go public, we won't just be coming out to the world. We'll be making ourselves a target. And Dr. Foster, she's not going to let this slide. She'll come after us." "We don't have a choice," Lily countered. "She's coming for us either way. And I'm tired of hiding." Nick leaned back in his chair, staring out the window. The city was alive outside, but it felt like he was looking at it from a different world now, one where nothing was certain. He had wanted answers, but now that he had them, he wasn't sure he was ready for what they meant. That he glanced back at Lily. She was right. The world was changing, and if they didn't take action now, they would never get another chance. They had to control their own destiny, or someone else would do it for them. "All right," Nick said, a sense of finality in his voice. "Let's do it. But we need to plan. We need to make sure we're ready for whatever comes next." And so they began to prepare. The plan was simple, at least in theory. They would go public. Not all at once, but strategically. The world didn't need to know everything right away. They'd make the world see that they weren't freaks or threats, they were people with a gift, with the potential to change things for the better. They would demonstrate their powers in a controlled, positive way, showing that their abilities could benefit society. But there would be no way to do it quietly. Once the world knew, there would be no going back. Nick reached out to the other gravity controllers, briefing them on the plan, giving them the tools to prepare. They would need to be coordinated, synchronized. No room for mistakes. They couldn't afford any slip-ups. They couldn't afford to show any weakness. The first demonstration would be in public, in a small park in the city. Nick, Lily, and a few others would show their powers, nothing too extreme, but enough to make people take notice. Enough to spark curiosity, to plant the seed of possibility in people's minds. As the day of the demonstration approached, the nerves in Nick's stomach tightened. He had never been one to seek attention, never been one to stand in the spotlight. But this was different. This was about more than him. It was about the future. The future of humanity. His hands shook slightly as he rehearsed his moves in the back of his mind. The morning of the demonstration, Nick arrived early at the park, scanning the area. It was relatively quiet, the usual joggers and dog walkers milling around. But there were more eyes now, he could feel it. People were beginning to notice the group gathering at the center of the park. They were watching. They were waiting. Lily approached him, her face set with determination. "You ready?" Nick took a deep breath, exhaled slowly. "As ready as I'll ever be." They stood together, surrounded by a handful of others who had agreed to join them, the ones who had learned to control their abilities, the ones who believed in this mission. Together, they made a circle, each person standing with their hands at their sides, eyes focused ahead. They could all feel it, the collective weight of their decision. But they didn't back down. Nick raised his hand, and the air around them seemed to hum. It wasn't just the sensation of gravity that he was controlling, but the very attention of the world. He concentrated, focusing on a small rock near his feet. Slowly, the rock began to lift off the ground, floating a few inches into the air. The people nearby gasped, their eyes widening in disbelief. Lily joined in, her own hands lifted. A few feet away, a small park bench began to rise, hovering just above the ground, as if defying the laws of physics itself. A murmur of astonishment rippled through the crowd. People stepped forward, trying to catch a glimpse of the impossible. Nick could feel the energy of the moment, the rush of excitement, but also the creeping fear. It wasn't enough to show the world what they could do, it was about showing them who they were. Lily stepped forward, her voice loud and clear. This is who we are. We are the next step in human evolution. We are not your enemies. We are not your threats. We are here to work with you. To build a better world. But you have to trust us. The crowd remained silent for a moment. The gravity controllers continued to manipulate their surroundings, floating objects, levitating small structures, and even walking along the edges of the park benches, defying the rules of gravity. Then, from the back of the crowd, someone shouted, "Freaks!" Nick's heart skipped a beat, but he didn't flinch. More voices joined in, shouting accusations and slurs. Fear was spreading, and it wasn't just from the crowd. Nick felt the tension in the air, a rising storm of anger, fear, and uncertainty. He could hear the unmistakable sound of sirens in the distance. It wouldn't be long before authorities arrived, but as the voices grew louder, something shifted in Nick. He could feel it, the rising power inside him, the understanding of what they had unleashed. He didn't just want to control gravity anymore. He wanted to control the narrative. He wanted to show the world that they had nothing to fear. Enough. Nick shouted, his voice cutting through the noise. He raised his hands high, and the entire crowd fell silent. The objects floating around them, the benches, the rocks, everything suspended in the air, they all slowly lowered back to the ground, gently settling as if nothing had happened. Nick took a deep breath, his eyes scanning the crowd. "We're not here to fight you," he said, his voice steady, his conviction clear. "We're here to change the world. But we can't do that if you don't give us a chance." The silence stretched on, heavy and uncertain. Nick waited, his heart racing, unsure of what would come next. Then, from the back of the crowd, someone clapped. At first, it was just one clap. But then another joined in, and another. Soon, the entire park was filled with the sound of clapping, tentative at first, but then louder, more confident. People began to cheer, their fear replaced by curiosity, by wonder. Nick could hardly believe it. But this was just the beginning. The world wasn't going to change overnight. But they had taken the first step, and for the first time in his life, Nick felt like he was finally in control of his own future.